So we just spent a lot of time talking about the kidneys and their functions, and essentially a lot of the things that we're going to talk about here are things that we've covered before and things that we've looked at for the kidneys themselves. So hopefully it'll be a little bit of a review in a sense. Some of it will be kind of new, and so when it comes to the fluid that we talked about in the body, and so we talked about the kidneys dealing with water balance in the body. And part of that water balance comes in the realm of where is the water itself. And so where do we actually have this water? And so it turns out that 2/3 of the water is inside our cells. And so it's within the cells themselves. It's intracellular water. So it's inside those cells. But another third of the water is extracellular fluid. And part of this is in the blood. So it's part of our blood plasma. And then another part of it is interstitial fluid. And so the fluid that's in between all of the cells themselves. And it's important when you think about back to things like the blood and the blood vessels and things like that, as far as how we were able to move, say, nutrients from the capillary into the cells. It had to go through that interstitial fluid first before it ever got to the cells themselves. And so we do have this intracellular fluid inside the cells. And so each one of those cells has its intracellular fluid. And then we have all the fluid that's in the empty spaces in between those cells, as well as the fluid that's actually inside the blood. And so we're able to have this concentration gradient that lies in between each space and allows us to move nutrients into the tissues, move waste out of the tissues, and back and forth and back and forth. This movement of fluids as well as solutes occurs. So when we look at it, we have intracellular fluid. So that made up 2/3 of the total fluid itself. This is going to be things that are inside the cells that are there. Large amount of ions inside the cells. We've got another quite a bit of proteins inside those cells as well. That is there. And then we've got our extracellular fluid, which combines our interstitial fluid with that of the blood plasma. And of course, inside there, we still have intracellular fluid inside the cells. And so we have all of our white blood cells and red blood cells traveling along inside there. And that amounts to a certain portion there of the intracellular fluid also. When we look at kind of the difference between the interstitial fluid and the plasma, we see that we have different components that are in with each. And one of the big things here in terms of differences is the protein. And so inside our interstitial fluid, we tend to have very little or no proteins whatsoever. And then we have lots of proteins inside the blood. We have all of those plasma proteins, all the things that the liver is producing and putting into the blood to help to carry things from one place to the next and so on. That's all found within that plasma there. And it's part of the reason why if those proteins leak out into the intracellular fluid, because we've got damage somewhere, or if the proteins arise out here from damaged tissue, that's then going to change our fluid dynamic, and we're going to start to get movement of fluid out into that extracellular space, into that interstitial fluid as well. So all throughout the day, we have a balancing act, and so we get water from a couple of different sources within the body. The main source is going to be from digestion, and so we drink fluids, we eat foods. Both of those provide for some water, whether that fluid is in terms of drinks, whether it's purely water or whether it's coffee or soda, juice, whatever it happens to be, we're getting water in through those into the body itself. And certainly some of those, like coffee and caffeinated beverages and things like that, as we learned with the kidneys, some of those may actually alter our water balance as well, but we're still getting the water that comes in with it. In addition, back when we looked at metabolism, remember that one of the things that occurred was that we got water as a byproduct. It's not a lot, but it does provide for some of the water that we get in terms of the body all throughout the day. And then we have our losses. And so we can probably think about the easy ones to think about, which is like the picture there. We have our sweat that we're losing. We also have in terms of urine production, we have that as a fairly easy process that's there. So urine production needs to be at a minimum of 500 milliliters a day, we said. And so we're going to produce at minimum that, depending upon our water intake and output, is going to differentiate on that. We lose water just by talking, and so as we even don't talk when we just breathe, but we know that if we talk for a long period of time, as when I'm recording and doing these, my mouth starts to get dry. I need to have a drink in between, and so on. And so I'm losing water in that way as well. Evaporation through the skin is occurring all day long as well. This doesn't just happen when we're sweating profusely and we can actually see the water on our skin. It happens throughout the day as our sweat glands produce sweat as well. So that happens within the body also. The sweating will exponentially increase the amount of fluid loss that is there. But the normal kind of sweat gland secretions are helping out with that loss throughout the day also. And then we have solid waste through feces. And so the digestive system is not producing essentially a excreted component that is all dried out. Again, this is going to vary depending upon the situation at the time. And so this could be a lot more water loss with that solid waste, or it could be relatively minimal. As we take fluid into the body, and so we drink it in, we eat it with our food, that creates a situation where inside our plasma, we now have a hypotonic solution. So we have an extra amount of water there that has diluted things. And we know that when we have a membrane and two different solutions on either membrane, that the water is going to want to move towards the hypertonic solution. It's going to try and go and dilute that water or that fluid compartment that's there. And so it's going to move into the cells, and the cells are then going to start to increase in size. They're going to potentially start to swell up as this is occurring. If, on the other hand, we've lost a fair amount of water, we now have a situation where now inside the blood in our plasma, we have a hypertonic solution compared to that of the cells, which are a hypotonic solution. And so in an effort to try and keep our plasma elevated in terms of the quantity that's there, we're going to have a water movement that is now back into the plasma, and then that is shrinking our cells. The cells are starting to lose their volume, and they're starting to decrease in their size. And if it's because we're talking and things like that, we may feel that the cells are starting, or the skin of our lips and our tongue and everything is starting to become kind of dried out for each of those. So when it comes down to it, as far as our water balance goes, we've got to look at all the different ways that we get fluid in throughout the day. And so for the minimums, in a sense, is what we're looking at here as far as our production of water, our input of water. We've got a fluid intake in the neighborhood of 1,200 milliliters a day. And so this is our drinks. These are the things that we're consuming. And in reality, this is probably a lot less. Many people carry around a water bottle with them throughout the day. If it's, say, a 32-ounce bottle, so something like that. Everybody's got their big hydro flasks and things with them. It's a 32-ounce or a 40-ounce thing. Right there in a 32-ounce, you've got roughly a liter. So if you're only drinking one of those a day, you've got almost your fluid intake that is kind of at a minimum that you would need for the day itself. We're going to get another 1,000 milliliters from just our food. So unless you're eating like dehydrated food all day long, you're going to generally be getting some water with it. Certainly the more that it's moist, fruits, vegetables, things like that are going to have a higher water content to them than some other types of foods that may be there as well. If you're eating something that's in terms of meats, if they're all dried out, they're cooked really, really well, things like that, their water content is going to reduce as well. We said that we also have this metabolic water production. And so the cells themselves are in our body are producing roughly 350 milliliters a day, depending upon their metabolic activity that's there. And that gives us a grand total then in the neighborhood of 2,600 milliliters. So for everything to balance out, that means that we've got to get rid of that 2,600 milliliters throughout the day as well. If we don't, that means that if our total output is not equal to 2,600 and it's lower than that, that means that the water in our body is going to increase. We're essentially going to have swelling, so to speak, in terms of that water staying within us throughout the course of the day itself. So how do we lose this water? And so we have some water that we just can't, in a sense, deal with, in a sense, or we can't change. And so we have to breathe. So we're going to lose some water through breathing. And so we have insensible water loss. This is our lungs. This is our skin just being there throughout the day, where we're not even sweating. The sweat glands aren't the problem. It's just that the environment that we're around is essentially drier than what we are as far as our body is concerned. We don't have a hard outer shell that keeps water from being lost at all. So that's a fair amount, almost a liter there, so 900 milliliters throughout the day. Sweat numbers, just from our normal sweat production throughout the day. This isn't even increased sweating with exercise or heat or anything like that. And then we have another 100 from fecal matter. And then the majority of our urine is going to be 1,500 milliliters. And so again, 500 of that is essentially from our amount that has to be gotten rid of. And so this is that very minimum that the kidneys can produce throughout the day is the 500. The other 1,000 then is going to be kind of like our variable amount. And so if we had more input, then that amount is going to go up or down. If we had less input, then that amount of that leftover 1,000 is going to change as well. So we could have either a greater than or less than 1,000 milliliters for the day, depending upon what our input was on there for the entire day itself. And so the urine part is what we can change. So we can, if we have more fluid intake, and so if our fluid in is increased, then that's going to mean that our urine output has to increase as well. And this should be output here. The book has it wrong in there. So our total output for the day is going to be roughly 2,600, give or take. And so the more water that we're consuming throughout the day, the more that output is generally going to be as well, all in an attempt to make it so that we have homeostasis throughout all of our cells. Because if our volume changes, we're going to have potential changes in the blood vessels, where when we have an increase in blood volume, this is going to lead to an increase in our blood pressure. So we've got increased volume, we've got increased blood plasma. That increased blood plasma means that the vessel that was being pushed on, in a sense, with a certain amount of force in terms of the blood pressure, now we increase the water there, and that force goes way, way up. So my arrows need to be much bigger and darker in there. And so the pressure has to increase. If it, as it does so, we're typically then going to get vasodilation, so that the amount of pressure stays back at normal. But we're going to have a limited ability to continue to do that over time. If we have underhydrated throughout the day, and so our volume is low, this can potentially lead to a lower blood pressure. And so now our blood pressure has fallen. We're not able to maintain blood pressure the way that it should. We go to stand up from sitting down, something like that, and all of a sudden we're lightheaded because we haven't maintained that blood volume throughout the day. And seeing where we can keep that at a normal kind of level. Next up, we'll talk about the actual contents of the volume as far as the fluids go, and take a look at the salts that are in there and how we can manipulate those to alter our blood volume.